we're going to look at a text which is going to have two parts to it. The first part is to look briefly at the achievement. In other words, what exactly happened after the brothers of the Christian schools came to the United States in 1843. How did they get started? They'd been trained in Montreal. Some were English speakers, some were Canadian speaking French, but also speaking some English. And yet very, very soon afterwards, we have the brothers publishing catechetical texts, publishing reading books, and so on like that. And this is one of these little corners which I think we're just beginning to lift the veil on, because there's a whole story there which we haven't really got onto yet. It's astonishing that we were publishing so early. I mean, after all, 1843, 1845 in New York, we're publishing by 1851. Where had these brothers studied? What did they know? Where did they, etc. So the first little part today will be simply to look at some interesting developments which I hope to be able to find out a little bit more about. But here's a book called The Christian Teacher, The 12 Virtues of a Good Master, done by Brother Agathon, and little bits added in here and so on like that. And it's published and translated by the Brothers of the Christian Schools and chiefly intended for the junior members of their society. And it's published in Dublin in 1846. And how many LaSalle brothers were in Dublin in 1846? None. When did the LaSalle brothers come to Ireland? 1880. Who published this book? The Irish Christian Brothers. Irish Christian Brothers, those of you who, very briefly, Edmund Ignatius Rice, a merchant, lost his wife, looked after a daughter who was hurt in an accident, falling off a horse, founded the Presentation Brothers in Cork. But the Irish bishops decided that these were very useful people to have as teachers, so they wanted them in their diocese, in the Diocese of Cork only. So they took the congregation away from him. After all, he was only a layman, so it didn't really matter, did it? He gave them the rule of Nan O'Nagle, the great woman who founded the Presentation Sisters. But in 1803, he decided to try again. This time he'd heard about the Brothers of Christian Schools, who of course had been suppressed in 1792 in the French Revolution, but were the only congregation brought back in 1803 by Napoleon. Why did he want them back? Well, because the kids were running wild in the streets. And so the brothers were brought back. Rice heard about this, and he sent over and he obtained our books. And he took the brothers' rule, and from that he wrote his own rule for his brothers. Brothers of the Christian Schools was a mouthful, so they became known as Christian Brothers. It's their title. And they very quickly spread, and the Irish bishops cast their eyes covetously once upon. Here's a wonderful group of men. We don't want them sort of running around. We want them to incarnate them in our own dioceses. So they tried to take over the congregation. So he sent to Rome to defend the congregation, and the cardinals in Rome, having looked at the situation, I don't know whether it was after a good Italian dinner or before it, but anyhow, they said, well, who are this crowd? And somebody said, well, they're just the Irish lot of that French group who have a bull of approbation from the Pope. Oh, well, they're okay. So they gave them a rescript based on our bull of approbation. And that's how the Irish Christian Brothers were saved from the Irish bishops. The first time. They had to save themselves again in the 1850s. Edmund Ignatius Rice was a great man. He attracted lots of people. These are very, very difficult years in Ireland, but they spread rapidly. They became very well known as the Christian Brothers. And as he got older, he decided he couldn't keep going very long, so he appointed a successor, or a successor was elected. This man's name was Paul Reardon from Cork. And he was absolutely convinced that they were the Irish branch of us. He was a great student, he was a very clever man, very good at languages, so he continued to translate the works. He took de La Salle's politeness book. Now, all the bits about wearing a sword and so on like that he left out. Not too good in Ireland during the penal days to be wearing swords. So now this time it's by the Christian Brothers. But you notice the signum fidei. That's our motto. That's the sign of faith. That's the star, etc. They're still convinced that, well, he's convinced anyhow. Now, in the meantime, he actually has applied to our Superior General asking to be recognized sometime in the 1830s. It's interesting that we have the reply to his letter, but not the letter. But you can tell from the reply of our Superior, he's answering a request. This in itself may be significant if you're like Dan Brown, but anyhow, that's just such an interesting little bit to sort of think about. In 1973, I was part of a study group appointed by Brother Charles Henry Buttimer to look at all the stuff between ourselves and the Irish Christian Brothers. We collected the material, we gave it to them, and for the very first time in 1977, they published their definitive history. Now, where did the uncertainty lie? Well, I'll just give you another example. The Christian Brothers, Irish Christian Brothers, had come to Australia in the 1840s. But there was so much drunkenness among the clergy that the Benedictine Archbishop decided they'd better put them into the monastery and they could become Benedictine Oblates. So after fighting him for 2 years, they said, thanks very much, and went back to Ireland. And one of them, who taught back in Ireland, taught a very promising young lad who went off and joined the Christian Brothers novitiate. But he was sent away as being not suitable. So, no work in Ireland, he came to the United States. And he came to New York, and he found actually there were these brothers there. This was now the de La Salle brothers. Sorry, they'd been called the Christian Brothers, but this was now this French lot. So he joined them, was accepted. He became Brother Paulian. He became the visitor of the very vast St. Louis district. He became the president of Manhattan College. Found unsuitable by the Christian Brothers, but still, you see. His younger brother joined the Irish Christian Brothers in Ireland, and he's always sending him books and exchanging letters with him. Just to continue what happened, so the brothers, finally, Irish Christian Brothers, came back to Australia in 1868. They came to Melbourne, they opened their school, and the house they opened still stands, and I still remember going in there as a young brother after they opened the door and walked in, and there is the statue of the founder, the statue they brought with them from Ireland, and the statue is the statue of the Venerable John Baptist de La Salle. So there was confusion with the capital K. And my own interest in... Oh. Sorry. I thought it may have been a special message coming to me about all this. Anyhow. So I think this probably, I'm just in the next couple of days we're going to try and look into the New York archives. I think there may well be a debt not yet paid from our side to the Irish Christian Brothers because of all the early books we started to publish. Some of the ones I've looked at, but not enough yet. Certainly some of the readers' books we published here in this country after 1851 are exactly the same content as the book published by the Irish Christian Brothers in Dublin. My guess is that the two congregations during this time, at least in the English-speaking world, had a kind of, oh, well, we're really all the same crowd anyhow. And even more significantly, the very first brother from this country, he'd come from Ireland originally, who became a member of the General Council in France, used to come from the States by boat. He'd go then back to his native Ireland on the way to the United States. And he was a great friend of a great Irish Christian brother, a great scholar called William Grace. And they used to exchange books and talk about books and so on like that. I don't know at what stage this kind of thing finished, but some of you would know the story that in 1880 we were asked, the British government, to quell the rebellious Irish, decided they should open a teachers' college, and they funded it. And the Irish bishops, of course, there was only one group that they were not going to have in that college, and that was the Irish Christian Brothers, whom they'd tried twice to take over and failed. So we were invited to take it over. And we opened the great teachers' college in Waterford. But Waterford was where the Irish Christian Brothers began. So their little school down in the poor part of Waterford, and suddenly we come into Ireland with Brother Azarias and Brother Batamian and all those great names from this country, and we opened the Teachers' College. It was like a sort of great big wet fish slapped across the face of the Irish Christian Brothers. And so relationships after 1880 between the Irish brothers and our own brothers were firm and polite, but never friendly. So that's a necessary thing to understand how we started and how we got going so long. So I'll just move on quickly. We come in the early part of the 19th century now to quite a famous book which was published in French. And I'll just give you the title page of it. This was published all over France, and it was called the Catechist Manual. And it's probably the most definitive description of the catechetical method ever published. And it was so good they presented a copy to Pope Pius X. And here's a famous letter, where this example that the Vatican can make mistakes, written to the Superior General of the Brothers, the glorious title of Apostles of the Catechism, by which in an audience of October 1902, it was actually 1903, but the Vatican can make mistakes, we were pleased to call the Brothers of the Christian Schools receives a new and eloquent justification in the Catechist Manual, which thanks to your diligent care and attention has just been published with a view to train catechists in the true sense of the term, or in other words, to form true teachers of religion in the schools, etc., etc. And then it goes on, etc., to talk about various lovely things, and I'll just hasten on. So the preface we bring out here in the States is only about a third of that book. They leave out little bits and so on like that, but some parts are word for word translated. But what's interesting, and perhaps it's important here, it represents probably, as I say, the most interesting statement with regard to catechetical method that I've ever come across anyhow. And of course the Pope then gives the title to the brothers, confers on them the title of Apostles of the Catechism. And it's this that accelerates our work in the States, so that we very briefly, we bring out the brief course. This is about 1911, I think. Well, this one is. That's the 5th edition. The original French is 1903, so if they were on the 5th edition, they must have been really churning it out. And now we start to bring out our own books. And this is the only complete course of religious instruction by grades, prepared by the Institute Brothers Christian Schools. Why you should introduce the series into the schools. The First Communion Catechism, in conformity with the encyclical of Pope Pius X, uniform answers, all in accord with this, and so on like that, etc. Now, by 1911, we bring out a complete course. And this course is the only complete uniform course of Christian doctrine, Brothers Christian Schools, by grades from kindergarten to seminary, comprising Catechism of Christian Doctrine for First Communicants, price 3.5 cents each, my goodness me. So, Christian Doctrine, Christian Doctrine, Christian Doctrine, Catechism of Christian Doctrine for high schools, academies, and advanced classes in Sunday schools. The above catechism in conformity with the decree of the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore, in other words, the Baltimore Catechism. Then, the Manual of Christian Doctrine for advanced courses in academies and colleges and seminaries, and then the Exposition of Christian Doctrine in 3 volumes with summaries and analysis, in reference for the teachers and the clergy, being a complete course of religious instruction in English, and the Catechist Manual, the indispensable tools, and so on like that. Now, I think, brothers will understand, I think that the exposition of the Christian Doctrine one here are the famous Dogma Moral Worship. Some of you knew? No. Oh. Well, for years they were called catechism. You're supposed to continue studying all your life. So you're supposed to continue a course of studies of dogma, then moral, then worship, then church history, then ascetics with optional exercises and things like this. So that, and the brothers used to do, had to do the examination on all these things on the 31st of December each year, which for us meant calling us back from the booming breakers at the beaches in Australia to sit down and write an examination. The brothers found it a bit hard to do that sometimes. They were sunburnt, or anyhow. But this was a complete course, and I think that's what this was. I think it was a translation originally from the French. Anyhow, obviously things were booming, and you can see that we obviously thought this was the most important thing, one of the most important things we were doing. And what did the bishops think about this? Well, Cardinal Gibbons says, I take great pleasure in giving my hearty congratulation to the complete course of religious instruction prepared by the Brothers of the Christian Schools. I am but voicing the sentiments of His Holiness Pope Pius X in hoping the series may have the largest possible circulation. Cardinal Gibbons. Then from New York, John Farley. Then from Philadelphia, and then as I point out to you, I give you the list of all the dioceses in the United States where we had schools where all the bishops say, this is the greatest thing that ever happened. So we were really riding the waves in those days. And what went wrong? Well, nothing went wrong, but people somehow began to feel round about the late 1930s something wasn't working. Something wasn't happening. So a group of brothers got together from all over the States, and they founded what was called the La Salle Catechist. Now, I would have thought there were dozens and dozens of copies of this. I finally managed to get a copy of this from the New York archives, when even Joe Grabenstein in the archives in Philadelphia didn't have them. I knew there was something. It must be very precious indeed. This came out of the District of St. Louis. Now remember, the District of St. Louis grew enormously, eventually totaling well over 900 brothers in the one district, but going all the way from the north, from Twin Cities and so on, all the way down to Mississippi, and many, many stops on the way. So, just continuing this rapidly, here is one of the editions, and I want to read this to you because it's this is the winter edition of the La Salle Catechist, dedicated to the late Brother Ildefonsus Barry, Ildefonsus Emery, a militant apostle of the Catechism. A militant apostle. And look what he's forward. This is his last lesson. My dear Brother Catechist, I'm offering the enclosed lessons to you and your confreres, hoping they may be helpful to you all in the great work of making the boys under your care understand the great truths of the Holy Faith. I recommend you to stress the chief point of the lesson by reflection, containing your own thoughts. However, we must be on our guard against sermonizing. You heard that before, didn't you? Lodge the vital thought in the mind by a few clear sentences or an illustration so that it will become a part of the young man's permanent knowledge and help to form his character. I pray God to bless your work. And the period of 45 minutes can easily be filled up, but preparation is required, sometimes of 30 minutes or more. Don't begrudge it. Time thus spent will be of greater merit and consolation to you when you are called to give an account of your stewardship than any other of your life. Beautiful, isn't it? So the last lessons of this great catechist. Okay, and here are a list of the brothers, and notice where they come from Illinois, and very much from the St. Louis district, but also from Canada, Toronto, etc. And this course, which begins eventually, begins in the St. Louis district, then becomes part of all the districts. We move on then to the war years and to general dissatisfaction that people are feeling about the teaching still. And there's a great brother called Brother John Joseph McMahon. He's a member of the St. Louis district. And he says, look, and you have this text actually in your thing, I won't read it out for you, but basically he's saying something like this. Look, we're trying to fill the kids' heads with abstract formulae about religion, what to do, what not to do. But he said, do they ever discover the person of Jesus? Do they ever discover who they are as Christians and so on like that? And he proposes to start a whole way of teaching religion that begins with the Gospels. And he begins writing all sorts of lessons based only on the Gospels. Self-taught and so on. And the lessons begin distributed around, and people start to use them. And finally he says, I'm going to go a whole series. I'm going to write something on Christ's life. And eventually, of course, these we have now, these are his notes bound up from the archives in Memphis. Saw this. These are the bound notes that he writes that eventually becomes the first Living with Christ series. And it's tried out. It's tried out in classrooms. And only when people say, yes, that's okay, etc. And then eventually the first volume appears, and then the second. It takes about 7 years for the whole thing to appear. And then that doesn't work for a while, and then in the 70s and the early 80s, people are thinking, well, that's not going too well. So they decided to do a whole complete revision of it. And this would bring some of you perhaps to your time in school, as teachers, or perhaps a student even, when they begin to circulate material, and finally they bring out, no longer bring out books, they bring out booklets, all enclosed in a little case and so on like that. Some of you may remember the one on, what am I trying to think of now, the musical. Sorry? West Side Story. Yes, West Side Story. Did any of you do that as in? He did. The West Side Story, yes. And who wrote those books? Young brothers. Brothers who were doing their university at the time were called in, and in summer camps and so on, they tried all this out. And for some people, it was a wow. It was tremendous, Religion actually is in real life and, real stories and so on like this. But even that eventually failed, etc. And as you know, we've been looking for the perfect solution ever since. We nearly had it last night with Holly, but we're not quite there yet. We're getting close, but etc. Okay, so the press then comes into being. Why? The press begins in a little corner initially in Winona, a hand press. And then it becomes a bit bigger. They buy an old Heidelberg, and then they start working on that. And gradually the press takes on a life of its own. And in that sense, St. Mary's Press comes quite directly out of the work of Brother John Joseph McMahon and out of two other very talented brothers who took it over, Alphonsus Pluth and Damien Steiger. I've given you all the details in the full text that I've given you. And as things get bad and so on like that, eventually they are saved. The press is saved because with all the attention to Scripture that comes up with the the whole movement, the charismatic movement that comes out of Vatican II, or precedes Vatican II but follows it as well, everybody's using the Good News Bible. And somebody thinks, well, why shouldn't there be a Catholic sort of version of the Bible? And this, through the work of a whole team at St. Mary's, eventually becomes the Catholic Youth Bible. And then the sequel to it, the one for the junior grades and so on like that. And I believe this is one of the extraordinary contributions we've made, not simply because it's a youth Bible, because of the incredible way, the interleaving, the introduction, the exercises, the comments and so on that go through the whole Catholic Youth Bible. I won't say that necessarily that young people pick it up and say, oh, rapture, you know, a Catholic Bible. No, but I think well taught and well produced, it's extraordinary that I find it an extraordinary achievement and a return to our very sources that in this country that's something that we've put into the hands of people. And of course it continues to sell. You know also, of course, that it's been brought out in Hispanic edition as well. And in that sense, there's a macro effect, I think, from the press, which I think we may be just on the edge of, I hope, a great revival. You probably know that the great difficulty the press has been going through, I won't go into a lot of detail on it, but basically, so long as the Bishop of Winona lived with the Brothers community, censorship was easy. You just did it at breakfast, at the breakfast table. After the bishop retired, and in more recent years, the bishops have established censors who are unknown and unnamed. I think they exist, but I'm not sure. But anyhow, so that what's happened in recent years with St. Mary's Press publications is that every time they tried to produce textbooks or something that were going to be in schools, and they would have, for example, something, say, at the Los Angeles meeting or St. Louis or any of these great things where the books were displayed, you had groups there waiting for them to ask questions. The questions were, why on page 73 is there not an index to question 1, 2, 3, 4 of the Catechism of the Catholic Church? The whole thing was programmed, laid waste, so and so. And we even got the ridiculous thing. I saw John Vitek, who runs St. Mary's Press, showed me one day a text that was sent back because it said, the church teaches. And in red below on the page it said, no, we should not use that expression because that implies that other people teach something else. That from an unknown censor should have been blazed right across, you know, every possible publication in the States, to my view. That is ridiculous. Where are you living? Back in a cave somewhere, are you? I mean, the church teaches. I can't say that because other people teach something else. Anyhow. So the problem having unknown censors is if you can't talk to anybody, you can't reason with them. When you can't reason with them, then you get fundamentalism doesn't start in the Bible Belt of the United States. Fundamentalism can be just as bad on the Catholic side as any other side. Probably not telling you anything about that anyhow. So we come eventually to the famous doctrinal elements. And these are very important. And I'm sure that in the 54 pages that you've perused with great attention, I'm sure by the time, if you started as I did when it first came out and read the first 54 pages, I paused for breath and thought, I've never met anybody who knows all this. But this is what is prescribed for high schools. Now, of course, obviously, everything has to be done according to the ability of people to receive it. So what I'd like to do then is sort of suggest that if you look at why do young people not see, this author, David Tacey, is a professor of literature in Australia who was fascinated by the fact that you can't teach literature in a university without the religious questions coming up in various ways. And again, he had students who had come to him, Jewish students, Anglican, Presbyterian, and asked him questions which were basically religious questions. So he volunteered to put on a seminar on spirituality. Just that word, spirituality. So they said, all right, well, you won't get paid for that, but okay. So at 11 o'clock on such a day in such a theatre, there's spirituality. You couldn't get into the theatre. It was packed out. There were more people standing outside than inside. So they reprogrammed it for the largest theatre they had. It goes on now twice every week. And who comes to it? Thousands of young people. It's not part of any course. It's an exploration of spirituality. And of course the very common thing, which I'm sure you hear from time to time, is sort of, well, I'm not into religion, but I have my own spirituality. It's this whole sort of spirituality, religion, put as opposites and impossible things to put together. Whereas I would like to think that the two things are complementary. That often spirituality finds its expression in acts of religion. But religion imposed on people, etc. So Tacey, writing about the critique he hears all the time, says, religion imposes the big story of theology upon our experience without exploring the little stories of our individual biographies, which might give theology a foothold in our lives. Religion is not rejected because a person does not believe, but because he or she is not believed. If religion expanded its horizons to include the spirituality of individuals, it might be renewed by such expansion, and individuals would not feel excluded, pushed out, or irrelevant. I think that's a very interesting observation, isn't it? So what I'd like to pursue now, if this was the achievement, if this is what's happened through publications, through the press, where we are today and so on, and perhaps the rebirth of the press in other forms where the emphasis from the press may well be on the pedagogy to teach rather than on the sort of examination of the doctrinal elements. So the distinction that Holly made yesterday between the actual text itself and the teacher's text is a very, very important thing to look at. And of course what you said about the website and so on I think is even more attractive. Okay. When Pope John talked about the idea of the council and all his cardinals collapsed, he said that the council desires that by way of fulfilling their role properly in the international community, Catholics should seek to cooperate actively and in a positive manner, both with their separated brothers and sisters, fellow Christians, who together with them profess the gospel of love, and with all people thirsting for true peace. And he takes this to the council. And the council goes on, and then, as I pointed out already, John dies. His successor is Paul VI. Paul VI comes into the council after its first phase. Everything, the balls are all still in the air, and he writes this document of 120 paragraphs, and 60 of them, 60 paragraphs, are on dialogue. Dialogue with the modern world. The church in the modern world. The church as a source of joy and hope, gaudium et spes. That's the direction the council takes. Dialogue with the world, not retreat back into the cave and man the barricades. Dialogue with the world. Be there where the questions are, be answering, and so on like that. And I think we've seen, we are living, I think, an attempt in some ways to take a lot of the council's directions back. That, I think, is fairly obvious in a lot of the what's called the restorationist movement, of which perhaps I think the return to the Latin or the return to a text based on Latin is only just perhaps an indication of a certain kind of unexpressed idea that further back the church was perfect and there was no problems. Before the council interrupted everything, things were much better. Well, I'm not sure we all agree with that. Anyhow, that's our church, and that's the one we've got to live in and be part of and fight our way and so on like that. Now, if you think about This probably is the most significant event, I think, in religion in the 20th century. John Paul II announced that he was going to go to Assisi and invite all the religious leaders of the world to come together to pray for peace. To pray for peace. Not necessarily together. If they didn't want to come together, let's pray in their own ways in different places. And they prayed in all various sorts of churches around Assisi. When this was announced, you won't find this written in any book, but so I'm told of this, so I don't know that it's absolutely true, but I've been told it's 101% true, so I'll just repeat it with that assurance. That when the Pope announced what he was going to do, 2 senior cardinals asked to see him. And they were sitting down and they were talking. They expressed their anxiety about what he was doing. And he said, no, well, I think I'm going to do this. The cardinals then both rose and took him around the knees and begged him not to go. But he did. And I think this is a very significant kind of thing. So you've got all kinds of different people there in Assisi, and they're not talking religion, they're just saying, each in our traditions, we come here at this moment on the 26th of October 1986 to pray for the peace of the world. And we know that there's been a repetition of something like that as well. And it's interesting when you read what the Pope says about this, saying in every authentic religious experience, the most characteristic expression is prayer. Every authentic prayer is called forth by the Holy Spirit, materially present in the heart of every person. Not necessarily known or acknowledged, but this is the way the Pope sees it. Normally, it will be in the sincere practice of what is good in their own religious traditions, and by following the dictates of their own conscience, that the members of other religions respond positively to God's invitation and receive salvation in Jesus Christ, even while they do not recognize him as their Savior. There is a mystery of unity in spite of the differences between religious professions. Now, this is a whole movement. So it's the Pope, it's this Pope who then says to the Jesuits, I want you to bring back and launch in Rome a whole series on interreligious dialogue. And so the Jesuits have somebody who spent the last 40 years living up in India, who's in dialogue with the Brahmins and so on like that. His name is Jacques Dupuy. And he's written one book. He comes back to Rome. He begins teaching in the Gregorian University. And then some group in Rome find something he's written as suspect. So he's suspended. For 2 years he's suspended. The poor man develops an ulcer. Anyhow, and then finally he's vindicated. That they say, well, if they publish edition, in the next edition, perhaps it might be good to have a footnote about something about this and so on like that. He's never found to be wrong. It's just that somebody wants him to shade what he's saying. Dupuy is vindicated. And what is very significant is that the head of the Jesuits at the time, Hans Kalvenbach, then makes a public press statement or a press appearance, media appearance, pointing out that they'd always supported Jacques Dupuy, that they were very glad to hear now that people who thought he'd done something wrong were now clearing of any, and you'd be pleased to announce to the world that Dupuy was now finishing a second book. There was something very, not triumphalist, but it was a kind of, well, we've given you every chance, now it's going on. I think the key thing about this is what Dupuy and people who've worked on things like this, we had the death only a few months ago of Raimundo Panikkar. Raimundo Panikkar was somebody who was Indian. His mother was Spanish. The father was Indian. He was brought up as a Hindu Catholic. And I don't mean just Hindu as race. I mean he was brought up as a Hindu Catholic. He was brought up in both religions. His doctoral thesis was presented in Rome just before the council started. What did this thesis say? It was a study of the traditional Indian religions, the Vedic scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita, etc., and the great classics, showing how where the Vedic scriptures begin with a kind of primitivism, something like that, that the movement is the search for the Creator, the search for the One. None of this could have happened. There must be somebody, there must be something, what they call the Atman, the concept of a creator, of a God. And his thesis is that the movement of Hinduism through the Brahmins, through the scriptures, throughout history is, and I'll use the generic word man because that's the word he uses, is human beings looking for their creator. It's what he calls an ascending revelation, the seek for, where the whole Semitic religions, Judaism, Christianity, the Quran to a certain extent, are rather people acknowledging the Creator and the revelation that he's made. Muhammad through the scripture, through the Quran, through Prophet Muhammad, Jesus, etc., etc., etc. And these two movements meet. That was his thesis. It was rejected just before the council. After the council, without a comma being added to the thesis, it was accepted as one of the greatest theses ever presented. Panikkar died a few months ago. The tributes to him are all around the world were just astonishing and well merited, I think. Because it seems to me that what Panikkar and Dupuy and all these people who've actually worked with other people and other religions are saying is something like this. No one set of words that any of us have can ever encompass the mystery of what we call God. We can't. We're going to try. We're going to try and all sorts of images and things like that. And so in some way, people like Dupuy and Panikkar are saying what we should be doing is going together hand in hand, ignoring our differences and recognizing the things we hold in common as we try towards something which is always going to be ahead of us. But something which we strive towards. In that sense, then, what I think is important is what challenges do we face today as Lassallians? And I don't want to keep going too long here, but I want to give a lot of space to you to open up. What are our challenges? Well, I think the biggest challenge we're facing now is the kind of thing we're doing here. We're responding to the challenge. We're going through a formation period. We're looking at the tradition, the heritage we come out of. We're looking at its strengths, how it started, and we're saying, how can we continue to pass on to another generation the faith of the church by letting other people see also the faith that we ourselves have? How are we going to have faith speaking to faith, and faith speaking to life, and life speaking to faith, as we reminded, Groom reminds us? This is one of our great challenges. And so something like you've done here in these couple of days, to me, is a great sign of hope. It's a great statement. Yes, that's where we're going. We have this wonderful heritage of what we brought to the States in various ways, etc., the wonderful contribution we made in a different kind of church and a different kind of world. Today, in this pluralist society, we're still there, and we're still going to help these new generations as best we can. And that means formation. The great division, Paul VI says in Evangelization of Peoples, is the division between the gospel and culture. It's the difficulty of our age, he says, where it's almost as though religion's pushed to one side because the culture ultimately grows, develops, etc. And there's this whole tendency at the moment in Western society almost to relativize the gospel, the Christianity that brought this culture into being. We've looked very briefly at the importance of education of faith. The education of in the faith. Education of faith. Not imposing, not just insisting, not just learning off by heart all sorts of formulae that don't have any relationship to life, but also through the study of religion. Not just, as it were, isolated in our little corner looking at, yes, well, Christianity and Christians and Jesus and so on like that, but recognizing the whole religious element which is part of every civilization. How interesting that the very laws which you passed in your legislation, we did in Australia in the 1870s, against religion being in any way part of schools and education and so on like that, all come out of the period called the Enlightenment. And they're still there, although the society's moved on. The 27 countries in the European Union that all prescribed religion, all proscribed religion back in the 19th century, every one of those 27 countries today has religious education as something which has to be taught in the schools. Now, it's not faith education. But you can't live in France and not at least ask, who built that great monstrosity called a cathedral? Why did they build it? How can you explain the history of art to anybody without looking at what the country... What about the history of music? Etc. like that. What about all these masses? What about the whole way, etc., music develops and so on like that? What about the kind of supreme achievements you get in classical music, say Bach, the B minor Mass, the Solemn Mass of Beethoven, and the others? Somewhere in all of this, the Europeans are saying, you can't understand culture unless religion is part of it. And what happens when you actually start to investigate things like this? Do people gain faith? Not necessarily. But at least they're exposed to another way of thinking, to a distinct form of thought and experience. That's what religion is. As I said the other day, it's not religion, it's not philosophy, it's not music, it's not art. It embraces all those things because it's a distinct way of thinking, distinct way of seeing the world. Both those things are important. And when I look at the courses that you're doing, the biblical studies courses, the church history courses, the study of other religions and so on like that, that's the breadth that we need, obviously. That's the only way you can actually bring up people in a pluralist society, particularly as immigration, the great movement of peoples which we are part of today, probably the greatest movement of peoples in the whole of history, people flooding out of Africa and out of parts of Asia and Afghanistan and Iraq and Iran and so on like that. We're part of that. And they bring their own religions with them. If people really read the Quran, if people really listen to the scholars and listen to the great Muslim teachers, we couldn't have this sort of dreadful mistrust of anything going with Islam. My own experience of working with Muslims in Lebanon, Egypt, Pakistan, Malaysia, and so on like that, is that these are people like ourselves, not graced by the Christian grace that we were graced, but graced in their own way and fervent in their own adherence to their own beliefs and raising people in those. Why do these Muslim teachers teach in Catholic schools? Because it gives them an opportunity to actually teach young people something about part of morality and things like this. Tom Groom's Education for Life is a very important book. Not everybody likes it. All I want to say about it, I say a great deal about it in the text, but I'll just say this about it. Those of you who read the book might remember that what happens is Tom Groom goes to Pakistan at the invitation of some sisters whom he's taught in Boston College. He's never been in Pakistan before, and he finds the situation, just as you would have found in going to any of the brother schools, that the sisters are teaching girls who are all Muslim. And yet, there is this absolute respect for the sisters. There is this, not enmity, but respect for the gift that they bring. There is actual interest in the school, in other religions, and what are the sisters, and why are they sisters, and what are they doing, and so on like that. And his whole preface to Educating for Life is saying, it made me realize that you could live in a pluralist society. What's dangerous, he says in that preface, is where you live in that society in your little cocoon or your little cabin, and you protect yourself against all those bad things happening around about it. What about letting other people see why you live this religion and what it's about? What about the sharing of gifts? Not just about the sharing of gifts. I've got something to offer you. Have we something to learn from Muslims? If any of you know any of the great Sufi stories in Islam, the greatest of the Sufi stories, the man who hears that his son has been killed. He doesn't know, killed by brigands in the desert somewhere. But he's out in the desert himself, and two travelers come. And he washes their feet, and he feeds them, and he gives everything to them. And as they're packing their camels the next day, he sees that one of them has something that must have been taken from his son. But, like Abraham receiving the angels, he speeds them on their way. That's it. Hospitality, the reception of others, the reception of angels, that's the great virtue. Doesn't pursue them to kill them. Sufi literature in itself, of which I've read a great deal, I was privileged to spend a year studying other religions and so on like that, are great human stories. But great religious stories about forgiveness. That this gift of hospitality overpowers every other thing, including the desire for revenge. So the travellers go off. That's where I think Tom Groom's preface to that book is interesting. And not everybody likes it. I know at least a couple of bishops who thought it was very dangerous. And if you keep yourself only in your own world, I can see, well, I'm not sure about that. Okay, we need to evaluate things. Okay, let me press on, because we're talking a great deal now about the new evangelization. Some people would say, you don't need the word new. Perhaps we never did it properly the first time. Probably we taught a great deal of religion, but not much really about the gospel. Perhaps you taught a great deal about going to Mass on Sundays and not eating meat on Fridays and things like that. And perhaps we did a great deal about the law of God, L-A-W, but not much about the love of God. Remember that the great Bernhard Häring, the great German Redemptorist theologian, rewrote moral theology in terms of the love of God. That was what the 3 volumes were about. And where did Häring learn the love of God? In a prison camp, as a chaplain initially with the Nazi forces that invaded Germany, that invaded Poland. And then when he ministered to Polish-speaking people who were German-speaking and so on like that, called before the Gestapo. And then called before the Gestapo again and so on. But finally, appointed as moral theologian to the Alfonsianum in Rome, taught there for many years, and wrote this whole rewriting of moral theology in terms of love instead of law. And I think a great lesson to us. So the new evangelization, I think, in that sense, and I'll give you a couple of texts, particularly from John Paul II's Mission of the Redeemer, where he reminds us that many people, like ourselves, are living in societies which once had the message, but where now the message appears to have been lost, and we have congregations that once were faithful and now falling away, all the things that Brother Dennis spoke to us about on the very first morning here. And so the task is to restart and to try and help people see the gospel again in other ways. Is it going to be done in words? No, it's going to be done in all sorts of other ways. It's going to be done by deeds. It's going to be by people seeing how others love others, by people serving, by people doing Matthew 25 in their own lives. The great Cardinal Cordero in Pakistan used to see me at Mass with the brothers and would always call me over afterwards and say, "Now, brother, remember that the brothers and the sisters are creating the church in Pakistan. We can do nothing. We never meet the ordinary Muslims. But you teach their children. And from you, they initially bring respect. But out of respect, then, they bring support. And out of that," he said, "they bring love, etc., etc." He said, "That's it." He said, "Your presence," he said, "is not," he said, "that you teach religion. You witness by your lives to the Christian religion. And that religion does not oppress. That religion does not try, in some ways, to make other people be something that they don't want to be." Interesting. Okay. Behind all of this, of course, there is the great mysteries. The great mysteries are so important. De La Salle sees them as the whole thing, the whole Christian story. And what I like about the bishop's document, the whole 54 pages of it, is that's all about the great mysteries. That's the Christian story. And what we're being reminded of by their presenting this as a complete curriculum is these are all the wonderful treasures that we have and we've inherited that need to be shared with the next generation. And what I try and point out in the text I've given you is that it's the way, it's going to be the pedagogy which is going to be very important in this regard. You don't do this simply by inflicting on people. You're going to have to try and do it in a way that says, right back to the medieval maxim which says, things are received, understood, according to the ability of the person to receive it. So you can't then, you may have to enter into dialogue, may have to enter discuss, may have to show, you have to and ultimately that we know that it's God's grace. Faith is a gift. Donum Dei, the gift of God. We've all known wonderful people. We wondered why they never had the gift of faith. Well, that's part of the mystery. But we've received it, and part of the receiving of it is not to bury the talent in the ground, but to try and share it. Our particular ability we have as teachers and the positions we have is to try and do this in a way which makes it possible for other people to accept it. I'll come to that in a moment, another angle. The disturbing part I have with the bishop's 54 pages is that each section finishes with a series of the kind of apologetics you're going to have to teach them. How to answer the problems of all those people lurking behind bishops. That was a bad smack. Lurking behind bushes, springing out saying, "What about the Inquisition?" I think it's very strange to finish, to look at that text and say that at the end now you remind them of all the arguments that you then arm them with to meet all the questions they've never been asked. I think this is a very bad preemptive strike. That's my own feeling anyhow. And the text I give you is the text from the Catechist Manual of 1903. Now this is the high point of the Church attacking liberalism. But there are 3 whole pages in the French edition about this, basically saying something like this: look, please don't spend a lot of time with your senior pupils giving them the arguments that other people are going, the arguments against the questions somebody's going to ask them one day. You don't do that. First of all, he said, by raising the very arguments that they're going to hear one day, they may appear much more powerful than the answer you have to give. He says it's not that way at all. Give them what you can, let them go off with the sense of what they've achieved. Yes, they'll get those questions. We've all got them. We've had them at different times of our lives. But it seems to me the preemptive strike attitude in that, I find that very strange. It's almost as though we're back in the cave again, defending the cave mouth against the barbarians or something. Anyhow, the people who ask the questions, it seems to me, first of all, are the students. And their questions are always more important than our questions. They're the ones we have to try and answer and be sympathetic to, and the ones we say, well, I don't really, there's no answer to that. Pain, suffering, death, all those things. We live with those questions. As with the great mysteries, we enter into them to understand them. And then I think our own sharers, as people who've received the gift of faith, who receive this in a particular kind of charism that comes through La Salle and the brothers, and who have a vision, the kind of vision we've tried to speak to these days. And just to... This particular citation has always had an enormous impact on me when I was at that stage of my doctorate, when you wonder why on earth you're doing this and why you're in a foreign land and what on earth, and would it be better to go out and play golf, and anyhow. I just find this a very, very powerful statement and a tremendous reminder for us. Just as important as the truth, says Kierkegaard, and indeed even more important, is the way in which truth is received. It would not therefore be much of an achievement to lead millions of persons to the truth if by the very way in which they were led, they found themselves outside of it. What a good example of this, the great Russian scientist Sakharov. You know, brilliant physicist, brilliant everything. Courage, allowed to do everything he wanted. But when he asks the hard questions, which then clash with communism, oh no, you can't go down that path. And so he becomes a dissident, therefore gets locked away all those years. He'd been led up, yes, this is going to save the world, this is going to save the world. But what about what? No, you can't question that. If the truth is imposed on us in a way which, in other words, destroys the very notion of grace and freedom, then, as Kierkegaard says, it's dreadful. It doesn't lead us, it oppresses us. I think we're going to do some of this on some of these images on the... Are they going to be available for people? So, I mean, those who are trying to copy it down, you'll get all those things as well. So, that's really where... I just will conclude with some questions. But to me, that's then where I want to sort of finish in some way. That we're dealing with faith and religion. And often the very teaching of religions can be an avenue of faith. You can receive a charism from a religion. Bill Johnson, the great Jesuit who spent all his life in Japan and became a Zen master, said that becoming a Zen master did not make him a Buddhist, it made him a much better Jesuit. It's the gifts that these different religious insights bring to us. And that, I think, is what's important about this. Both words are important. The faith we've received, the faith of the church, which we're going to try and communicate to others, but also the very vehicle that often will carry this to us are going to be things like religion. World Youth Days, music, get-togethers, soup kitchens, all the things you do because of the faith that's in you, all those ways in which, by coming together with other people, your faith is strengthened and you mutually strengthen one another's faith. The last text, the text that you have is fairly long, but most of the detail, most of the points I've made, you'll find there in detail in the text itself. So, do we take a break or we open some questions? All right, so you really should stand up and stretch, I think, because that was... But anyhow. So, questions, observations, etc.
I guess I'm thinking of the word trust that I mentioned earlier, a day or two ago, that to teach religion, you have to have faith to communicate that to the student, and you tell stories of your own struggle with your faith and so forth. And sometimes I'm reflecting on this framework, that it doesn't trust us to communicate that faith. It's giving us, I'm not sure what it's giving us, It's not trusting us.
Yes, yes, I know what you mean. It's giving us, saying, provided you get this material put into their heads, etc., this will be all right.
Facts.
Yes. It's where I do think that the thing Holly talked about last night is very interesting, that possibly the pedagogy is the point that we bring to it. It's the way you bring people to it that's going to be very important. And certainly, as I say, I always think, ever since Gabriel Moran's writings, when you look at his emphasis there all those years back on freedom, and of course the document from the Council itself, no one is to be forced to embrace the faith against his own will. This synod therefore forbids every act of coercion in matters religious. I was part of a study group while I was doing my doctorate where we investigated the fact that in England, by law, 1944 law, you must have one act of collective worship in each school at least once a week. And I was asked to investigate what this meant in the Catholic schools. So I was given 10 Catholic schools to go to, and I went round and made appointments, and it was interesting. I'll talk about going to one school in Birmingham, which of course now had become very multicultural and so on like that. And I went to the headmaster, and my task was eventually to sit down, not with him, but with the Year 12 boys and girls. So I went to him, and just etc., and he welcomed me. And I said, "What do you call the subject of religion?" "My dear chap," he said, "we're very classically minded here. We teach geography, geometry, geology, so we teach theology." And I said, "Oh, I see, it's all," yes, it is. So I said, "Well, now, you've got young people, they're mainly 17, 18 years of age, so I suppose you have school masses from time to time." "My dear chap, we have school masses every month." Now I said, "When the school mass is on, do you, the Year 12 boys and girls, do you invite them to come, or are they expected to come?" "My dear chap, they must come. This is a Catholic school. They will come. They must come. They came to this school, they will go to Mass." But I said, say if somebody said, "Well, I prefer not to go to Mass." "My dear chap," he said, "they shouldn't be in the school." Anyhow, we walked over to meet the Year 12. We turned a corner, and there's a quadrangle. Been raining. And on the far side of the quadrangle, fully 100 yards away, were two boys kicking a soccer ball. But this wasn't recreation time. So he produced a whistle, and he blew it and shouted, "Bring me that ball!" The kids, of course, somebody's blowing a whistle somewhere. They didn't. Kept on kicking the ball. He advanced across the quadrangle, blowing the whistle again. They looked up. Oh. So they came towards him, kicking the ball from one to the other. And he finally said, "Give me that ball." Boy flicked up with his foot and went right down his shirt front. That was an interesting prelude to meeting Year 12. What do you think Year 12 was like once the headmaster had gone out the door? Well, the roof came off. I asked them about their religion, about sort of like that. They found the whole thing irrelevant. They found they were being made to do things which they didn't want to do. They were compelled to do it and so on. It was horrific, that's all. I went to another school in the East End of London, very poor, multiple nationalities, and I'd met the headmistress. Then I was left here alone with the Year 12 girls. We were one girl was explaining to me why she used to go to Mass, didn't go to Mass anymore. And the door behind me opened, and the girl continued talking and so on like that, and nothing changed. I realised after a while the headmistress had come in. And she didn't go and stop. She just kept on talking. The other girls kept on. How interesting. In many ways, that was a school where if they had Mass, they'd say, "Well, we invite you if you'd like to come to Mass," da-da-da-da. And she said it was interesting. If they were involved in preparing it, they'd all want to go. If it was a question just of being there, sometimes they'd say, "Oh, well, I'm behind in my studies, I want to stay in the library or something." But at least the freedom was there. You think of what the whole thing of, well, they must go, they'll get heaps of grace. Not quite sure how there's heaps of grace and where they are. I've never discovered them anyhow. But so, yes.
I'm wondering about all the schools, because we do require everybody to go to Mass. Are there any schools that when you have an all-school Mass, that there's an option instead of going to Mass?
Everybody goes.
everybody goes? So maybe it's an attitude, because I'm concerned now to look at our own policy, because we're only 65% Catholic, and again, like so many of our schools, the Catholics are name only in many ways, or have rejected their Catholicism. Yet we're all we join together, and we all joke about how many first communions there are at masses. We don't like emblazon a C on the foreheads of, so we're not quite sure who's receiving communion and who's not. But that's just an interesting question.
No, well, it is.
I don't think they're coerced. I don't think,
No.
But it's just, we go to assembly, we go to
Yes.
things, and we go to prayer services or liturgies.
Now, I certainly wouldn't want to exaggerate the point and say that the main thing is to look over backwards and all this sort of thing. I would think in grade schools I'd have no problem at all about, okay, that's part and parcel thing. But there must come a moment, I mean, it's obvious that's what they themselves are doing at the weekend. I therefore think sometimes that if the thing is so precious to you and so important to you that you would never want anybody there under coercion, you invite. That's all. Most of our schools in Australia now would invite. We wouldn't. I'm talking about the particular 11s and 12s. But, yes. Yes.
Kind of a response to what you're saying there, Pam. We kind of found the same thing. We're in the same boat as your school. But we went back to the drawing board and we had a teaching mass this year. And I can't tell you how many kids just kind of, the priest that did it was very interactive. So for us, we found we had to sit back and ask ourselves the question of, obviously, even kids that are Catholic aren't going to church, so let's find a way to, and I think the kids' response was great after it, and the adults' response was great after it, which was another check for us to be able to kind of look at it and say, well, how can we look at this a little different? And it was a really positive thing that we started the year off with. So maybe it's not optional, however, it's taking a moment and teaching about it. So that was something we found to be successful.
I think this is one of these key things, where we're sensitive to things. I think a key role in all of this is to see where do the faculty sit. I get very distressed if I'm at a school mass and all the faculty are in the 3 back seats, almost as watchdogs or something, or perhaps not taking much part in anything.
It's more than that.
Yeah,
I think that's a key observation. That you go to many school liturgies, faculty and staff, particularly those who, at the time whenever the school is moving to liturgy, if you don't have a class, that crowd of faculty and staff are standing in the back. I think it's a certain statement.
It is a statement, yes, in itself.
As opposed to being among and with the students celebrating.
Yes. Yes.
It's something we had shared, I've shared along the way. I think the idea of a teaching mass, because I think we assume a lot. We assume that people know what is happening in the liturgy. That includes Catholics, right? And so I continue to ask the question, where in curriculum is there liturgical catechesis?
Okay.
Right? As high as we place Eucharistic liturgy, right, as the summit, right, of our worship. Within curriculum, to go back where we started, I personally know of no place that intentionally has liturgical catechesis in the curriculum.
Okay.
And to put a finer point about the difference between sacramental theology and liturgical theology.
Yes, teaching sacraments is not teaching liturgy.
Right.
It's not teaching liturgy.
Especially, yes.
I teach all the freshmen at St. Ray's, and I just finished a week and a half of nothing but the Mass. From beginning to now, and what we do, why we do, all of that. But I wanted to answer your question. While it's mandatory at our school, we do a good job of, in our classes, inviting the non-Catholics to come on up for a blessing at communion time.
Right.
And we do it at the very beginning of the Mass. The campus minister gets up and, we've already said it in our class, but she repeats it. And I've always found it really, I don't know, heartwarming, or I'm not sure what the word I want, to see, like the seniors have been seeing it and doing it for 4 years. They're teaching the freshmen that this is okay,
Sure.
and the faculty members who aren't Catholic go up with their arms folded to get the blessings. And it's a great witness, not Catholic witness, but it's a great Christian witness that it's okay to do this. And they're all witnesses to the younger kids, and then next thing you know, those freshmen are the seniors teaching, you know, the next generation coming up.
That's wonderful. I think that's a wonderful way of doing things. And, you know, I'd love to think of more schools doing that. I've had the experience Ernest is talking about only too often, seeing the faculty are all sitting at the back, and this how, but also that you invite all your teachers as well, and that it's all done pre-communion time, is it? It's done before Mass begins. Yes, I think that's respectful and also educational, isn't it? Wonderful. Okay. We're pushing time, I know, but we have the last question. We don't have to. We've got all the answers now, so that's all right. Anyhow, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to. I was challenged to, and Ernest asked me to write this. I felt I had to write something, and I'm glad that you will receive the actual texts themselves, because the texts are heavily footnoted and so on like that. And I hope in some ways they point towards something. And if as well we get the opportunity to sort of see the visual part, some of those things we had today particularly, that I think is important, because some of those citations are things that you won't find, well, you will find them somewhere if you hunt hard enough, but they're things I've picked up over the years, and sometimes they're very important ones. Just cement a very important idea, particularly the whole interreligious dialogue. You'll find one little thing which I didn't develop here, but you'll find it in the text. I'm astonished the way in which the 54 pages lump together ecumenism and interreligious dialogue. Seems to me these are so different that it's almost as though the position taken from the writers is, well, we're sitting in the church, and looking outside the church we see Protestants or non-Christian or other Christians, and we see interreligious people. But it seems to me ecumenism is probably in most of your classrooms already by the very people who are sitting there. And increasingly it's going to be also not only ecumenism, but also people of other religions, other great world religions. So I mean, I think there's a whole kind of way in which the two things need to be separated. Indeed, if you were going to start from life and from where things are really happening, it would seem to me that you start very much from the ecumenical groups you've got there in the very school itself, or from the interreligious groups. The example I gave of the Muslim boys going around explaining why they fast in Ramadan. They're little things, but they're things about understanding, and they're about respect and about all sorts of other things. Anyhow, that's... So,
Brother,
yes.
You mentioned respect.
Yes.
And I don't want to sound arrogant or disrespectful, but isn't that the reason why the entire community of the school, regardless of Catholic or non-Catholic, why you go to Mass? Because out of respect, not because you're being forced to? Because I totally agree with the idea that we should respect other faiths and their traditions and where they're coming from. But shouldn't it be true for the other side of the coin, that they should respect the idea that we are a community and we should come together as a community at Mass?
Yes, I think so.
But it's really, therefore, it shouldn't be an idea that you're being forced to come together. It's more that we should respect the idea that we're coming together.
Mm-hmm. The example we've just had, you see, the school where they actually invite people.
And that's an excellent idea.
Yes,
I love that.
To me, I would find that even more respectful, if I could put it this way, because you're acknowledging also the importance of these other people, not as being any less, but of the whole mystery we're all living, isn't it? Of separated in terms of Christian churches, and other people that haven't been graced, that have been graced by their own tradition.
And the Eucharistic ministers are the seniors, so it's not like they're getting a blessing from the priest, although some are if they go up the main aisle.
Okay.
But the seniors who are our Eucharistic ministers and altar servers who are around the church doing all of this blessing, they're taught, they're given a retreat on what they're doing and why they're doing it and how to give a blessing.
Yes.
Cool.
Well, we had Lent a few years ago I was at, where among the school leaders there happened to be a young Sikh boy who not old enough to wear the turban. So he was wearing that sort of cap with a little top knot on it. And he was one of the school leaders. So they were giving out the ashes on Ash Wednesday. So here he was giving out the ashes and so on like that. And one of the parishioners said to me, "Brother, what's wrong with that poor boy? He had an accident." And I said, yes. Because if I said to her he's actually a Sikh, I think she would have expired on the spot. Anyhow, that's. But I thank you I thank Ernest and for the opportunity and share with you that I think it's one of the. I'm often asked, do you believe in Catholic schools? I believe passionately in Catholic schools. I believe. Just watching even what happened with our brothers under communism, they let priests go back to their parishes after they were put into the camps for 6 and 7 years under hard labour. They never let the sisters or the brothers go back to communities. They knew the communities were stronger than the individuals. And when they finally let the brothers and sisters out, the brothers they let out, they could never go back to community and they were never allowed to teach. The communists knew the power of the person who teaches. The nuns were locked up in these convents of concentration that I was able to visit sometimes, and I used to visit a place way up near the East German border, way up in Bohemia, and 850 nuns, 51 different congregations, all put there, all Slovak, set up at a Czech. All the Czechs were sent out into Slovakia because the moment you open your mouth, you're a foreigner. 2 brothers worked the farm there for many years. And eventually the communists themselves, they came to the sisters, "Look, my parents are getting old and they need someone to look after them. We'll let you out. You can go each day and look after my parents." And da-da-da-da. And gradually they let a number of the nuns out to do different kinds of things. And then there were secretly postulants. Girls joined them. By the time the communism fell in 1989, they estimate there were over 1,000 young women who were secretly members of religious congregations in Czech and Slovakia. And that came from those individual nuns, etc., and the witness they gave by their lives and so on like that. But the point I took there, and I saw in Vietnam as well, is our schools were taken from us. Our 24 schools, we've got the title deeds, they're taken from us. The communists know that the most powerful group of people who are the people who work with the young people.